Brief timeline of Black women's sexuality throughout U.S. history. Since the point of encounter between colonizer and colonized, Black women's bodies and sexuality have always existed with an oppressive power dynamic. As men sought to settle America and institute chattel slavery, they were faced with a predicament. These women challenged their notions of family structures and marriage with non-Western and matriarchal family. More importantly, they could not utilize the same notions of fragility and weakness in creating a workforce of women for free labor. They were paradoxically sexually attracted to the same indigenous and Black women they sought to conquer and dehumanize. Thus, as racial differences were cemented in favor of justifying one of the most horrific forms of systematic labor extraction in human history, the gender differences of Black women set them apart as not only non-white, but also non-women. There are numerous writings by European settlers about the fundamental physiological differences they saw in these women, which frame some of the beginnings of racialized stereotypes and encounters. Richard Lingan, when visiting Africa, wrote that Black women's breasts hung down below their navels so that when they stoop at their common work of weeding, they hang almost to the ground, that at a distance you would think they had 6 legs. These white men tried to convince themselves that these women could be bestial, sexual, strong, attractive, and repulsive all at the same time, attempting to utilize biological projections of difference as evidence of their violence and distorted desires. Once on the plantation, Black women faced the particular gendered burden of reproductive labor and resisting ongoing sexual assault by their masters. They were expected to do just as much labor as men and at the same time reproduce more slaves, knowing their children were to be used as a commodity. Saida Hartman writes, "The material relations of sexuality and reproduction define Black women's historical experiences as laborers and shape the character of their refusal of and resistance to slavery. The theft, regulation, and destruction of Black women's sexual and reproductive capacities would also define the afterlife of slavery. The particular ways in which Black women's bodies have been exploited sexually, economically, and reproductively are still largely invisibilized. Black women had no protection from their slave masters. The story Incidents of the Life of a Slave Girl is a harrowing tale of one young woman's quest for self-autonomy in the slave system. When she was 15, her master, Dr. Flint, sought to have unlimited sexual access to her and built her a private cottage. Harriet Ann Jacobs says, "If God has bestowed beauty upon her, it will prove her greatest curse. That which commands admiration in the white woman only hastens the degradation of the female slave. I know that some are too much brutalized by slavery to feel the humiliation of their position, but many slaves feel it most acutely and shrink from the memory of it. I cannot tell how much I suffered in the presence of these wrongs, nor how I am still pained by the retrospect. My master met me at every turn, reminding me that I belonged to him and swearing by heaven and earth that he would compel me to submit to him. If I went out for a breath of fresh air, after a day of unwearied toil, his footsteps dogged me." Jacobs was not only sexually, physically, and psychically controlled by her master, but he was able to utilize his ownership of her children as a further form of assault. From the time African Americans achieved emancipation from chattel slavery, emancipated peoples obtained a second-class citizenship with their freedom, having fewer rights and less autonomy than their white counterparts. As the Black Slave Code cemented into Jim Crow laws, the impacts of institutional segregation, redlining, and legal inequality continued to impact Black women's sexuality. In the Progressive Era, Black women continued to face extreme opposition. Aaron Chapman describes the institution of the sex-race marketplace. The new Negroes sought to accomplish self-transformation and social change, not only through the didactic speeches and publications their predecessors in the Reconstruction generation had used, but more specifically through their participation as producers, consumers, and commodities in the interracial arena of social communication and negotiation that was the sex-race marketplace. This was both an actual marketplace offering tangible goods for sale and a discursive space formed through and around the arresting images, teasing language, and fantastic territory of modern popular cultural productions. In the sex-race marketplace, both the tangible goods and the intangible ideas that gave the goods meaning, the ideas, fantasies, thrills, hopes, judgments that were sold along with the goods, were steeped in racialized and sexualized language and significance. In the Progressive Era, Black women continued to face extreme structural oppression. Though they were supposedly free and became more visible in mainstream culture, an ironic juxtaposition formed. On the one hand, there was the lure of respectable blackness. Women who were often highly educated and Christian in their values sought to appeal to white values of chastity and purity, seeking what would look more like the notion of white womanhood. On the other, there were continued stereotypes that hypersexualized black women, particularly represented by black women who became famous singers, such as Ethel Waters, Ma Rainey, and Bessie Smith. Their songs had lyrics which used sexual innuendos, and they were marketed as wearing clothing that was revealing and suggestive. This left a huge gap in both the representation of black women that was beyond the virgin whore archetypes, and also left black women unable to represent themselves in their complexity. The images that were portrayed of them were generally highly mediated. The exclusions to this rule were women who were considered to be more respectable and able to modify their own image, such as in the case of Madame Walker, still aligned with a respectable ideal of femininity to assimilate into whiteness. Furthermore, after slavery, black women were still sexually assaulted by white men without repercussions. At the same time, black men were being lynched in the South for raping white women without evidence. As Ida B. Wells said, the miscegenation laws of the South only operate against the legitimate union of the races. They leave the white man free to seduce all the colored girls he can, but it is death to the colored man who yields to the force and advances of a similar attraction in white women. Black women were not only being raped in large numbers, but had no access to the same legal system that persecuted the men in their community and were unable to put their rapists on trial or receive justice. Though rape was not used in a reproductive economic practice as it was in the slave era, it continued to be a way of keeping black women in their place. Sexual assault contributed to degrading black women. It upheld the social order which placed them as second-class citizens in second-class submissive jobs. This continued to happen until the case of Betty Jean Owens. In Tallahassee, Florida, at least 400 people witnessed Betty Jean Owens face her attackers and testify on her own behalf. The lack of public acknowledgement of sexual assault mixed with hypersexual or asexual popular images gave black women an impossible choice and didn't afford them full citizenship either way. No matter how respectable or disreputable black women were by white standards, they could easily fall prey to sexual violence at the hands of white men. Indeed, it has been thought that the clearly apparent injustice surrounding sexual assault in the case of Betty Jean Owens was in part what sparked the civil rights movement. 6 weeks after Owens' trial, Patricia Stevens Dew organized Tallahassee's first Congress of Racial Equality meeting. A year later, they successfully desegregated local lunch counters, theaters, and department stores, as did black college students throughout the South. The civil rights movement, black power movement, and black nationalist movements were further areas where black female sexuality was contested. Many of the men argued that women should be mothers, wives, or sexual relief in the revolution for a new nation. In the black power movement and black nationalist movements, there were common ideas about how black women's reproductive labor should be utilized in forming a black nation. Male leaders still headed male-dominated movements, as this structure was the most understandable to a patriarchal society, even though many black women were on the front lines of the civil rights movement. In the Black Panther Party specifically, Elaine Brown recounted the ways in which women were considered to be less valuable to the movement or valuable predominantly for their sexual and reproductive labor that they could offer. In her autobiography, A Taste of Power, the book ends with Elaine Brown fleeing the potential violence she and her daughter may face as a backlash for temporarily being a leader and making her male Black Panther counterparts feel emasculated. However, it is worth noting that since the FBI and COINTELPRO infiltrated this movement, we cannot know to what extent to which they influenced the patriarchal tendencies of the Black Power movement. Amping up any conflict and brutality that already existed would have been an effective tactic for the FBI, considering the critical ways women served and built up the party. There were movements such as the National Welfare Rights Organization, led by welfare mothers themselves, such as Johnny Tillman, who sought to bring further political rights to women subjected by the welfare state. The welfare state controlled and monitored black women's sexual partners. In the transition to the neoliberal era, black women were continuously scapegoated as welfare queens. In the 70s and 80s, large numbers of Black people remained unemployed, and women were subjected to the welfare state. Strict regulations were enforced regarding the household, which often forbade women to have male suitors or male partners and demanded that they report private information in order to surveil Black women. In the movie Claudine, which came out in 1974, the main character, a Black mother of 6, struggles to raise her family. Her partner almost leaves her because he is worried about having to face the same surveillance that she is bound to if he wants to stay with her. The social worker monitored both of their incomes, household items purchased, and how often they saw one another as an ongoing form of racial dominance. Similarly to the progressive era, there is a way in which, in the current neoliberal era, Black women cannot act correctly in a white supremacist surveillance state. Today, there are still huge levels of inequity. Samuel Watkins looks at the rise of the video hoe and how Black women are still not in control of their narrative around their sexuality. He argues that Black women continue to be hypersexualized in the media with staggering results on their physical and mental health. Many women who rise to rap fame are forced to remain hypersexualized and utilize tropes of misogyny if they want to cash in. As this media is produced, the statistics of Black women with AIDS continues to rise. In 2016, among all women who received an HIV diagnosis, 61% were African American, which is a staggering number considering that African Americans make up 12% of the U.S. population. Farah Jasmine Griffin looks at how Michelle Obama and Beyoncé, though exceptional and prominent figures in the U.S., are still highly subject to the surveillance of their sexuality. Even Michelle Obama, who one would expect to be considered respectable in the U.S., has been depicted as manly, aggressive, and unladylike, showing the ways in which Black femininity is still considered to be a deviant form of sexuality. Beyoncé, on the other hand, still relies upon certain ideals about the mulatto, the eroticized and fantasized woman, using depictions of high-level prostitution from the French quarters of New Orleans, remnants from the post-slavery days, in her work. These are some of the wealthiest and most powerful Black women in America, and even they are still subject to policing around their sexuality and face dehumanization. Certain nuanced portrayals of Black women's sexuality are starting to be well known in the media, such as Issa Rae's Insecure. Themes of sexual rejection, being the sole breadwinner, and the overwhelming tiredness of trying to find love in an oppressive society are prominent in her work. Until there is equitable trauma treatment care, government representation, reparations, and a cultural value for Black lives, and the lives of Black women in particular, this fight will continue. Efforts by Black women to visibilize the violence towards themselves and towards Black women's sexuality as a whole, such as Me Too, Say Her Name, and the Black Lives Matter movements, have sought to shift the ways that Black women are still left behind. Sexual autonomy is one way in which the battle for Black women's liberation remains a contested battleground. As a society, we have a long way to go in furthering the liberation of Black women. Sexuality and bodily autonomy is just one part of the ways in which these historical barriers persist today.